Hi, my name is Martha, and this is the presentation of the article Vetted Encryption, written in collaboration with Martijn for Indocrypt 2020. And we'll start off the presentation with the definition of vet, which is to appraise, verify, or check for accuracy, authenticity, etc. In our scenario, a sender is vetted in order to send confidential messages to a particular recipient, and whether a sender is vetted or not is publicly verifiable, although we don't use a list for this. Instead, when a sender is vetted, they're given an encryption key that they can then use to encrypt messages. And the verification of vetting is then checking that the ciphertext has been constructed using such a vetted key. Now, there's similarities to filtering, and one can envision a third party between the sender and the recipient doing the recipient's bidding, where the filter ensures that only messages originating from vetted senders make it on through to the recipient. And this can describe many different scenarios. For example, spam filters for email, but also making sure that only registered users are allowed to post on a bulletin board. So one aspect of this, which is important, is whether or not a sender is identifiable to the filtering party. And we propose primitives for both scenarios. So in the case where the filter knows the identity of the sender, it's covered by identifiable vetted encryption, or IVE for short. In the case where the filter doesn't know the identity, it's covered by opaque vetted encryption, OVE. And there's similarities to other primitives for both cases. So for IVE, there's similarities to identity-based encryption, wherein two parties that are identifiable to each other can send each other confidential messages. However, typically for identity-based encryption, you don't have the notion of public verifiability because it runs counter to other security notions for encryption. And when you do, the verification relies on a interaction between the verifier and the recipient. And this doesn't really match the use case for IVE, or OVE for that matter, where we envision that the recipient sets up the filter once and then doesn't need to interact with it any further to determine whether a particular sender is vetted or not. For OVE, there's similarities to group signatures. Group signatures allows one to determine whether or not a member of a group has signed a message. But in order to pinpoint exactly which member has actually signed the message, one needs a particular opening key that's typically reserved for the group manager. Now, group signatures are signatures, so they don't really have a notion of confidentiality associated to them, or message recovery, which is something we need for OVE. However, because of the other similarities, we are inspired by group signatures when we construct our own OVE scheme. In particular, we're inspired by the BMW construction. So, given this brief introduction, we can now dive into IVE first. And for IVE, there's the following structure. There's a key generation algorithm, a derivation, encryption, verification, and decryption algorithm as well. The decryption, the key generation, produces both a public key and a secret key. The public key is given as input to the encryption and verification algorithm, and the secret key is given as input to the derivation and decryption. Derivation algorithm always takes as input the identity and uses this to derive a encryption key for a user, which is then used to encrypt messages. Now note that the identity is given as an explicit input to both the verification and decryption algorithm. So given this basic structure, we can start building the security notions that we require for this scheme. And we start with the notion of integrity, which is based on the following game. So the adversary is given the public key of the IVE scheme. She's also given access to a derivation oracle seen on the left hand side, where she queries an identity and gets a handle H in return. She may use this handle to either corrupt the identity by querying her corruption oracle and getting the encryption key back, or she can use the handle to encrypt messages under identities where she doesn't have the encryption key, using the encryption oracle on the lower left side. She's also given access to a decryption oracle. Now, the challenge for the adversary, given all these aids, is that she should output a tuple of an identity and a ciphertext, so that the identity is uncorrupted and the ciphertext has not been returned to her from the encryption oracle, and also that the ciphertext verifies under the identity she has specified. And for an IVE scheme to achieve integrity, this challenge should indeed be hard for an adversary. And this captures the notion that it shouldn't be possible to bypass the filter, that the only way to actually have a ciphertext which verifies is to be a vetted sender. We also have the notion of confidentiality for IVE schemes, which is similar to the notion of confidentiality for public key encryption schemes. Here, the adversary is given the public key of the IVE scheme. Now, because the secret key is used for decryption purposes, we obviously can't give it to the adversary directly, but she still needs to derive encryption keys, and for this purpose we give her the derivation oracle seen on the upper right corner. She's also given access to a decryption oracle, and she queries her cipher oracle, challenge oracle, with an identity, encryption key, and two messages M0, M1, and she's given the encryption of one of them. And her challenge is to distinguish between encryptions of M0 and M1. And now, as is the case for encryption schemes, this captures the notion that ciphertexts shouldn't leak any information about the underlying plaintext. So a naive approach to construct an IVE would be to combine an identity-based signature scheme and a public key encryption scheme in an encrypt and sign construction. However, the problem with this is that you don't achieve confidentiality, because in this case the challenge ciphertext is just a tuple of a encryption of a message alongside a signature of that encryption. But in this case, the encryption key is just a signing key, which the adversary has, and she can then just re-sign the encryption to achieve a new tuple, which is a valid query to her decryption oracle. And in this case, she will trivially win the game. So what we need is unicity of signatures, as well as an identity-based signature. So as far as we know, such a primitive has not been suggested previously, so we do suggest it in the literature, and the way we achieve this is using the standard certificate-based transformation for a signature scheme, wherein the key generation is de-randomized, so the randomness used to derive signing key and verification key is dependent on the identity using a PRF. So it's shown that when using this construction on a signature scheme, one achieves an identity-based signature scheme. So we just apply this same transformation on a unique signature scheme. And in addition to the normal security notions for identity-based signature schemes, we also insist on outsider unicity of a UTBSS, where the adversary is given the verification key and also a derivation oracle, and she should output a tuple of an identity, a message, and two signatures, where both signatures should verify on the message and identity, but they should not be equal. Now, we do allow for distinct signatures on messages, but we insist that finding a pair of distinct signatures that verify should be difficult for an adversary here. And now, given this building block, we can construct an IVE using an encryption sign. So the key generation of the IVE is just the key generations of a public key encryption scheme and a unique identity-based signature scheme. The public key of the IVE is the public keys of the underlying schemes, and the same with the secret key. The derivation is just the derivation of the underlying signature scheme. For encryption, we encrypt the concatenation of the message and the identity. The reason we concatenate the identity at the end is to link the encryption directly to an identity, which we will use during decryption. Then we sign the ciphertext and return the tuple. Verification is just the verification of the signature scheme. For decryption, we decrypt C and then pass it as MID, and then we check that the concatenated identity matches the one given as input to the decryption algorithm before we output M. Now, integrity follows quite easily from the unforgeability of the signature scheme, and confidentiality follows from the confidentiality of the underlying public key encryption scheme, as well as the outsider unicity of the signature scheme. And that covers IVE, and we can move on to OVE, which has a similar structure as IVE. So there's a key generation, derivation, encryption, verification, and decryption here as well. Though note that the identity is here the output of the decryption key, not input. Another difference is that key generation outputs not one but two secret keys, an issuing key and a decryption key. But here as well, the issuing key is given as input to derive alongside the identity, which outputs a user encryption key, which is then used to encrypt messages. And as was the case for IVE, we now use this to build up security notions for these schemes. And we start with the integrity, which states that any adversary with access to all the keys of the scheme has to output a ciphertext C. And the winning condition for this game is that the ciphertext should verify, but also output a invalid message or identity. So for an OVE to have integrity, it should be difficult for anyone to output a ciphertext which passes the filter but then opens to something nonsensical. So being able to do this means that you will be able to essentially spam the recipient with either a nonsensical message, or you wouldn't be able to pinpoint who sent the message, which is not a desirable quality. We also have privacy, and here we give the adversary access to both the public key and the issuing key. And we can do this because we've split the properties of the secret key into both issuing and decryption. So the adversary is here able to derive any encryption key she chooses. She also has access to a decryption oracle here. Now she sends EK0, EK1, M0, M1 to her challenge oracle that answers with the encryption of one message under the corresponding encryption key. And here as well, she should be able to distinguish between M0 and M1 encryptions of them in order to win the game. Now, this reduces to confidentiality if the encryption keys are the same, but it also reduces to anonymity if the messages are the same. And we give a explicit proof of this in the full article. And here as well, the intuition is that ciphertext shouldn't leak any information about the content of the plaintext, but also who sent it, unless one is in possession of the secret key. Finally, we have the notion of traceability, which is a security notion from group signatures. Here, the adversary is given the public key of the encryption scheme, of the OVE scheme. And here as well, she has a derivation oracle that she can query identities and get a handle. She can use this to corrupt the identity by getting the encryption key, but she can also use it to encrypt messages for identities where she doesn't have the encryption key. And here as well, she has a decryption oracle. The challenge of the adversary is then to output a ciphertext, so it hasn't been given to her by the encryption oracle. It's not under a corrupted identity, and also that the verification accepts the ciphertext. The intuition here is that an adversary shouldn't be able to impersonate anyone, so that even a vetted sender is not able to produce a ciphertext which opens to a different identity. Now we can move on to constructions that achieve this. And again, we're inspired by the B&W construction for group signatures. So the key generation is just a key generation of a public key encryption scheme, a signature scheme, and a NISC. The public key of the OVE is the public keys of the underlying schemes. The decryption key is the decryption key of the public key encryption scheme, and the issuing key is the signing key of the signature scheme. So here the derivation is just producing a certificate, a signature on a particular identity. The encryption is the encryption of the using the encryption scheme on a concatenation of the message, certificate, and identity under a randomness R. We then use all these four components to produce a proof showing that the sender does indeed know all the components that went into producing the ciphertext C. Verification is then the regular verification of the NISC. And for decryption, we decrypt using the encryption scheme and then parse the result as the message and identity, which is then output. So as for IVE, the security notions follow quite readily from the properties of the underlying schemes, but for full proof and also all the details for the constructions, you can check the article, full version, which is now available on ePrint. There you will also find more on background and references and so on. Thank you for watching.